Welcome back to Cheddar Movers, everyone. We're here on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and Hong Kong protests and violence are intensifying after police and protesters clashed at malls over the weekend, leaving 200 people arrested and more than 70 people injured. With us now for the latest in Hong Kong is Dean Cheng, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Dean, thanks for taking the time here with us today. Is this a sign that there is no end in sight for violent protests?
Certainly there's no end in sight for protests. I think that the source of the violence remains unclear. There are various reports of people, perhaps not from Hong Kong, being part of the violent substrata. But it's important to note here that we're talking about protests that have numbered at times 1 million, 1.5 million people. The vast majority of these people are not violent.
Right, and the violence also seems to happen sort of mostly on weekends. During the week, it seems like business as usual so that these shops can stay open and they can conduct their business here as well. But the violence seems to have at least gotten a little bit either more media attention around the world or it really has gotten worse. And then we are also hearing that tomorrow on Tuesday, there are protests planned to mark Guy Fawkes Day, and that they will be wearing, these protesters, the mask, which was, banned by Carrie Lam, but mask, of course, to mark Guy Fawkes. How do you think Hong Kong will respond to this tomorrow?
I think that the fact that the protesters are clearly planning on wearing masks is an act of overt defiance. And I think it is going to really put a lot of pressure on Carrie Lam and the Hong Kong police about how they are going to deal with this. Are you really going to try and arrest protesters who, for very good reason, given China's omnipresent social credit scoring system and facial recognition software, if you don't wear masks, the chances you will be identified and arrested are very high.
And so what about the intervention from Beijing? We heard that they may be threatening to intervene more in this situation in Hong Kong.
Certainly Beijing is watching this with a great deal of concern. You're looking at a festering sore. You're looking at a problem that is getting global attention. I think Beijing had really hoped that, as in 2014, the protests would sort of peter out after a few weeks. Here we are months in, and we still have massive protests. But I also think that this being the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen, the Chinese authorities in Beijing are well aware rolling tanks into Hong Kong is not a good idea.
Right, and aside from that, it seems like they have overall, on the Chinese side of this, they are actually not sending them in just yet. Do you think, though, that they will at some point?
I think it very much depends on the issue of violence. I think that if you see attacks against Hong Kong police, if you see an uptick in violence across the board, if you saw significant property damage. Now, we do seem to have reports of an attack on Xinhua, which of course is a Chinese state media organization. That is the sort of thing that if it became more widespread, I think that you would see in Beijing a lot more serious discussion about open intervention.
We think about what people in the U.S. here know about the situation, what officials can do about what's taking place. Is there any role that the U.S. does have in Hong Kong's search for democracy here?
Well, I think one of the most important things that the United States can do is to make very clear to the authorities in Beijing that the U.S. and the world is watching, that if the Chinese do decide to intervene, especially with force and violence, that this is not going to just occur in the dark of night and that everyone will go back to business as usual the following Monday morning, that there will be consequences. I think that that's a very important lesson for Beijing. At the same time, I think that underscoring that the U.S. supports nonviolent protest is equally important.
Is the U.S. doing this?
We seem to be, making statements through the State Department, through the White House, through Congress. Although I have to say that on the part of private business, when the NBA decides that criticizing China is somehow bad for business, that I think sends the wrong message to Beijing.
How do you expect other businesses to react? Should they? Is it a smart decision to get involved in this conversation from a business perspective?
Obviously, businesses have to respond to their stockholders. You folks are there on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. That's a key aspect. But at the same time, I do think that companies also need to realize that actively censoring Americans over the issue of Hong Kong flies in the face of American principles and also raises real questions about what exactly you're willing to do for the sake of your bottom line.
What about the economy there in Hong Kong now? It is in an official recession here with 2 straight quarters of GDP decline expected to continue to decline. What is the signal for what the options are for those who are still living inside of Hong Kong?
Well, I think that the folks in Hong Kong are very concerned, obviously, about their livelihood. And, the protesters, as well as the authorities, are all walking very fine lines. The protesters, if they want popular support, don't want to bring about a recession. The authorities, their credibility is in part keeping the city running. Hong Kong is a global financial center and business center. Keeping things running smoothly as a business is vital to its survival.
And so for businesses, how far do you think this will impact some of those small businesses that are in the region that can't get to their own shops, their own places of work?
Well, I think that, for example, when they shut down the airport a few months back, that had sent repercussions through the entire business community, small businesses as well as large businesses. I think companies that are part of the supply chain, supplying small, specialized items, et cetera, are definitely going to feel the pinch. Smaller businesses just don't have the overhead to amortize their costs. And of course, Hong Kong is closely tied to mainland China economically.
Yeah, and just on that point, there are some who have criticized the protesters, those who are living in Hong Kong, and just sort of reading their analysis. Their argument is that Hong Kong needs China every bit as China needs it. From that perspective, do you feel like Hong Kong should, in some ways, reevaluate the way that they are approaching these protests?
Well, many of the protesters would rebut that argument by pointing out they live in Hong Kong. And more importantly, especially the younger protesters, what they are saying is, in 2047, Hong Kong loses whatever legal protections have been extended to it under the Basic Treaty. If you're 20 years old, 2047 isn't that far away. What is Hong Kong going to be like when that happens? So I think that both sides have to be thinking about where are they going to be tomorrow, next week, but also in 2047.
Right, and that's the argument to make for those that have sort of supported the expedited version of this transition period, of course, not giving the folks their universal suffrage. But I just think it's ironic also that Carrie Lam actually had to invoke the colonial era emergency powers for the first time in more than 50 years. But, that's largely being ignored right now. Dean, thank you so much for being on with us this morning. Dean Chen is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation.
Thanks.